Thank you so much for attending our session today. Just to introduce myself, my name is Tracy Boyes. I'm a data protection and privacy attorney. I've been practicing in this space for about 6 years now. So perhaps you've seen me talking about GDPR and POPIA and all those privacy regulations. But today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. So today we're going to be discussing DORA. We're obviously going to get into exactly what it is. Yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm based in Cape Town, but yeah, and I'm obviously part of Scytale. Okay, so in today's agenda, obviously what we're going to be discussing is what exactly is DORA and what industries are impacted. Who does DORA apply to? I think probably quite a few of you in the room today are wondering, like, oh my gosh, does this even apply to me? What is DORA? You've perhaps heard, buzz on the internet. You've heard the January deadline is coming, and you're starting to panic. We're also going to discuss the timeline. I see that I'm frozen. Okay. I think in the chat box, can you just let me know if you can hear me and is my video working? All good. Okay. All right. Sorry, I just saw a message that I was frozen, but yeah, just let me know. All right. So back to the presentation. So obviously we're going to be discussing the timeline for compliance, which I think is obviously really important. You need to know by when you need to comply by. We're also going to get a little bit more technical, so go into the 5 pillars of DORA. So, actually drill down in what is DORA and what is this regulation talking about, and then, practical steps that you can take to comply. So I think let's start with a poll. As webinars do, let's start with a poll. So I'm going to begin a poll now. How worried are you about your upcoming DORA compliance? If you can just let me know how you're feeling. So you're feeling chilled, are you freaking out? Do you have absolutely no idea what DORA is, which is completely fine. That's obviously why we're here today. And, are you feeling okay, but you have some questions? Okay, I'll just give it another moment just to see everyone to finish voting. I mean, it's completely fine if you've never heard of it. That's obviously why we're here, to educate you. Okay, so no one's freaking out. That's a good thing. Okay, so here are our results. So we've got some people say they're feeling chilled, which is good. A few people are saying they have absolutely no idea what DORA is, which is completely fine. And some people are feeling, okay, but they've got some questions. So, of course, as we're going today, I'm completely happy to take as many questions as possible. I actually love questions. So if you have any questions, please pop it in the chat, in the questions chat, and then I'll get to them. I'll probably get to them at the end of the presentation, but if I do see something come up that's completely relevant to what we're discussing right now, we can also go through it as we're going. But yeah, so let's get into, like, what is DORA anyways? So I think what's really important is let's first take, we've heard the DORA acronym being, I guess, advertised everywhere, all over the internet. And no, it's not DORA the Explorer, unfortunately. That's a lot more fun for those of you who have children. But this is the Digital Operation Resilience Act, okay? So what I want you to think about, for those who have never heard of DORA, is that the key word here is the word resilience, okay? It's really, really important. So this act is a regulatory framework that's established by the EU. Because it is a regulation, it applies to the whole of the EU. So for those of you who are familiar with, like, let's say the GDPR, for instance, you know that if you're part of the member states, you have to comply with the GDPR. The same is with DORA, if obviously you meet the criteria. I would say this act is, it's making huge cyber reform for the financial services sector. From reading quite a lot about it, I see that there were quite a lot of different regulations floating about. Each member state had different laws to regulate the industry. And this law is kind of saying, okay, guys, let's bring it all together. Let's just make one clarifying law that we all comply with. So I think it's obviously going to bring a lot of reform and just make things easier, So there's going to be one full act that applies to the whole of the EU. And it ensures that the financial sector is resilient to digital disruptions such as cyber attacks and system failures. So, as I said to you, the key word here is resilience. Okay. So, think about it as if you're someone in the financial sector and tomorrow you get attacked, okay, by a terrorist organization or really expert hackers, and they are demanding ransoms, for instance, or your ICT service providers, they get attacked. There's a huge system failure, for instance. Anything like that, DORA is trying to prevent that from happening because obviously, when huge banking and financial institutions go down, all their ICT service providers, that can obviously really affect the economy. It really causes quite a lot of havoc in the industry and within your country. So this act is all about ensuring that there is resilience within the sector and that people are prepared for any sort of digital disruptions such as cyber attacks and system failures. Okay, and then obviously, who does DORA apply to? I think that's probably one of our main questions that we need to answer today. So it's firstly financial entities based in the EU. So think about it as almost all regulated financial services and financial marketing infrastructure. So basically, if you are in the financial industry whatsoever, you need to comply with DORA. So I think quite a lot of you today would probably fall into the next criteria, which is the critical ICT third-party service providers. And this is if you are based in the EU or not in the EU. There's also a slight indirect application for non-critical ICT service providers. But I think the focus today of our presentation would be, are you a financial entity or are you a critical ICT third-party service provider? And that's really what we're here to unpack. So firstly, what industries are the most impacted? So we're going to be looking at financial services, the tech industry, fintech. The obvious ones are obviously banks, investment firms, credit providers. So just remember that it's actually a very broad scope. So, when you look at the app, when you look at the definitions, it's very, very broad. So it's almost anyone that is somewhere in the financial sector would be regulated by DORA. I think maybe a question to ask yourself is, am I very regulated? So if you know in your heart, we're in a very regulated sector, and it's, leaning towards financial, then DORA probably does apply to you. And also remember that it's companies that are located anywhere in the world that have clients who are EU financial service clients, okay? So it's just like the GDPR all over again. Doesn't matter where in the world you are, DORA will find you, just like the GDPR. So remember that even if you are a critical ICT service provider, I don't know, based in Australia, for instance, just because you're based in Australia, the mere fact that you are servicing EU financial sector clients, or you have clients in the EU, that means you also have to comply with DORA. So yeah, it's just like the GDPR. If you have any experience there, it's what we call extraterritorial. And what's also really important today is that the deadline is the 17th of January 2025. So that's not long at all. A few months away, and there's Christmas in between. So it's really around the corner in terms of laws. And what's really important to remember is that there are no transitional agreements. So there won't be a grace period. Usually there's a lovely 1-year grace period. Not with this act. You need to be ready by the 17th of January. Now, what's also really interesting about this law is the proportionality principle. So once again, I'm going to hark back to the GDPR because I'm finding that quite a lot of regulations are written in this sort of way. I think it's like the EU have a sort of a recipe now for how they write regulations, and they're kind of following the same recipe. So if we're looking at our recipe, it would be the recipe of proportionality. So the regulation enshrines the principle of proportionality, stating that financial institutions should take into account their size and risk profile when implementing security measures. Okay, so once again, just like GDPR, you need to do what is reasonable in the circumstance to comply. So you need to look at your level of risk, the size, how crucial you are in the industry, what type of financial data are you processing, and then from there you'll be able to figure out, okay, well, how many security things do I need to put in place to accurately comply with DORA? And then, as I said to you, we've got the 5 principles of DORA, which are quite important. So I would say the Act is really, based around these 5 principles at all times, or the 5 pillars, as you can also call them. So firstly, we've got the ICT risk management and governance principle. So this principle is quite important because it applies to financial sector clients or financial sector services, as well as the ICT third-party criteria. So if you are a critical ICT third-party service provider, as well as in the financial services, the first pillar is really important to both of you. It would really be it's the foundation of DORA. So you must, of course, identify, assess, and manage cyber risks at all times. It's also really important that you come up with a governance and risk framework. So it's all about coming up with this ICT risk framework that you will obviously comply with. I think what's really important to note with this first principle is that if you've perhaps done your SOC 2 or your ISO 27001, a lot of the principles are covered again under DORA. So what's quite nice is, I guess from a sleeping peacefully at night point of view, is that if you have already done quite a lot of steps in terms of compliance with your ISO 27001 or your SOC 2, then you can say, okay, cool, at least, we're maybe 60% of the way there in terms of complying with DORA. So that's, I think, some good news. So it's not this massive mountain to climb. Also, what's interesting is that if you know you have to comply with DORA, from a financial services and critical industry point of view, then you don't have to comply with NIS 2. So it's actually like one or the other. But if you don't have to comply with DORA, then you have to comply with NIS 2. So just a little fun fact to throw in there. And then our next pillar of DORA is all about incident reporting. So it's obviously crucial for transparency and accountability. And so this law is obviously all about preparing you for cyber attacks. And if you do have a cyber attack, how are you going to report that incident? So just like the GDPR, there will be various regulation, supervisory authorities that you will be reporting to. Depending on your country, the authorities might change. Also, depending on your industry, some sort of, for instance, like the insurance industry, the banking industry, they all already have their own supervisory authorities. But it's something that you need to note that when I do have an incident, firstly, I need to find out what happened. I need to know in terms of incident response, how quickly do I need to report my incidents. Obviously, timely and effective reporting is really important under DORA. So the reporting, obviously, timelines do change. It depends how critical of an incident you've had. So it can be anywhere from 4 hours to 24 hours to 72 hours. So those are the rough timelines at the moment. But as I said, it obviously all depends on the type of incident that you have. And then our next pillar is our digital operation resilience testing. So once again, that's going all around, what DORA is. And remember, I said to you, it stands for resilience in the Act. So it's all about our digital resilience. And it obviously ensures that institutions can withstand digital disruptions. Financial institutions must assess and test their resilience. So if you are a financial institution, you are expected to, ask yourself, are we ready? If we get a cyber attack, How are we planning to survive a cyber attack? If we have a system failure, what are we going to do about it? If there is a natural disaster, what are we going to do about it then? So it's all about your business continuity environment, and how quickly can you recover from a major disruption? That's basically what DORA is all about. So, I mean, touch wood, you don't have a major disruption or a major cyber attack, but, unfortunately, these things do happen. System failures happen. So it's all about how quickly can you actually recover from any sort of major disruptions. All right, and then we have our next pillar, which is our ICT third-party risk management. So this is all about our supply chain security. So you'll obviously have your financial entity here, and then we are giving data to any sort of ICT third-party providers. I think perhaps now in the digital age, why this act has probably come into being is because previously, banks, for instance, were brick and mortar. And you went to the bank, you had your cash, you withdrew your money, you wrote a check. And those things are all kind of things of the past now. I mean, I know, especially in the UK, there's quite a lot of banks that, don't even have an address. They don't even physically exist anymore. And I think quite a lot of European countries have service providers like that, where they just exist in the cloud, which is just wild, how obviously amazing technology is. But because we've gone so digital, banks and financial institutions are so heavily reliant on our ICT third-party service providers. And now the law is saying, okay, well, because we're so reliant on you, now we need to watch you and check that you are also compliant. So that's really what this third pillar of DORA is all about. So it's all about our supply chain security, and includes contractual obligations for security and risk assessment. So firstly, over here, the lawyer and me will say, okay, well, we need to back our any contractual agreements. So you need to check, especially if you're fulfilling the role of the financial entity, anything in terms of my obligations in terms of DORA. Am I backing that with my third party ICT risk service provider? So if I have agreed to any sort of obligations with DORA, am I passing those obligations on to the ICT third-party provider? Remember, if you are a financial entity, the obligations do still fall upon you. So it's kind of like, you're in charge of the data and you need to make sure you're protecting it. If you are giving data off to any sort of third-party provider to manage on your behalf, you need to make sure that those obligations are carried on to that third-party service provider. So it's obviously this law is ensuring that the whole supply chain is prepared for cyber attacks, system failures, any sort of disruptions, and how quickly you can bounce back from those disruptions. So I would say for your third-party service providers, you need to think about, are they certified under ISO 27001, maybe in terms of cyber essentials or SOC 2. But that's somewhere where I would start is, do they have any sort of certifications? Also, if you are fulfilling the role of the ICT third-party provider, think about, okay, well, that's something that you can maybe discuss with your financial entities and say, okay, but guys, we are certified under ISO, we are certified under cyber essentials, we've gone through the audit, we are regularly monitored. And that can obviously help you with your reputation in the market, as well as closing new deals, or obviously keeping ongoing deals with any sort of financial entities. But I would say under this pillar, your contractual obligations are really important. So you need to work, like I said, you need to make sure you are back in your contracts, and that any sort of SLAs that your ICT provider can actually meet the SLAs, and that they are bound by basically the same obligations that you are as a financial entity. And like I said, as a financial entity, you are accountable for any sort of third-party compliance. So that's really, really important. So I would say in terms of the 5 pillars, those are the most important that you need to think about right now in terms of DORA. The 5th pillar is important, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's as important. Obviously, if you're looking towards the deadline on the 17th of January, information sharing isn't as important as the first 4 pillars, but obviously it is still important. So information sharing is basically saying to you, you need to share the threat of intelligence, and best practices are encouraged. So, if you are in the industry, and you're obviously testing your digital resilience. Maybe there was an attempt at cyber attack, but you were able to prevent it. Any sort of learnings that you find in the industry, you are encouraged to share that with your with other financial entities. So perhaps you are part of, a particular regulation or a board or a certification or anything like that, or any sort of group. You might want to start information sharing within those groups. But yeah, threat intelligence sharing and best practices is really encouraged under this regulation. Okay, so on to, am I an ICT service provider? Okay, so remember I said very important to figure out if you are a financial entity or a third-party ICT service provider. Financial entity, like I said, very broad definition. You probably know in your heart already if you are a financial entity, and if you're going to be regulated under DORA. You're probably already used to being rigorously regulated in your industry in any case. But perhaps if you're an ICT service provider, this is new to you, because you haven't really had to have gone through such heavy regulation before. But as you can see, it's a bit of a mouthful, but I have copied exactly from the Act the definition of an ICT service provider. So it means a digital and data services provided through ICT services to one or more internal or external users on an ongoing basis, including hardware as a service and hardware services, which include the provision of technical support via software or firmware updates by the hardware provider, excluding traditional analog telephone services. So, as you can tell, quite a mouthful. But basically, what it means is that, I've bulleted there quite a few examples. So it could be ICT facilities, software licensing, which excludes SaaS, ICT consulting, cloud services, including SaaS and PaaS, ICT risk management and ICT audit, telecom carriers, digital analysis, computation, any sort of hardware providers. Yeah, they all form part of this ICT service provider designation. So I obviously highlighted there in my little bubble. I said critical service provider designation. So that's something you need to start asking yourself. And obviously, we'll go through a few guidelines as to whether you could be one. So maybe you want to write this down, but these are some questions to ask yourself. So firstly, ask yourself, what is the size of my company? Okay. The larger, the more important, the more we're going to point to this critical designation. And then in terms of crucial to operations, so say to yourself, okay, I am this ICT service provider. I'm obviously giving services to financial entities. How crucial am I to their operations? Okay, if you know already, oh, I'm very crucial, then you're probably going to be under this designation. Then also ask yourself, what would the impact be of a disruption? So, if, for instance, you as an ICT service provider were to go down, what impact would that be on the financial entity? So if you are crucial to operations and any sort of disruption of yours would basically bring down maybe a section or large sections of a financial entity, and interrupt their operations in quite a major way, then you are probably going to be designated as this critical ICT service provider, and then DORA will apply to you. Remember, I said to you, it doesn't matter if you're sitting in the EU or outside the EU, as long as you have European clients who are financial entities, then this act does apply to you. Also, say to yourself, are there few alternative providers? So maybe you're in such an industry that is very bespoke, highly, highly specialized. If you happen to be in one of those industries, then you can say to yourself, okay, well, there's like 3 of us in the market. There's 3 options for this very bespoke service, and if I were to go down, you know, it would cause quite major disruption within the financial sector. Then I've got news for you, but you are a critical service provider under DORA. Okay, and then you're probably asking yourself, well, what are the practical steps I need to take to get ready? Obviously, this is quite a technical law. You know, it's very you know, it's financial, it's banking, it's yeah, credit. It's a very technically written law. I've obviously tried to make it as easy for you to digest as possible. But I would say my first practical step to getting ready is to answer the big question that we've been trying to answer today: is, am I a financial institution or a critical ICT service provider in the EU, or providing services into the EU? Okay, so that would be my first step. You know, for those of you who answered on the survey saying, I had no idea what DORA is, maybe now you know, okay, well, we don't fall into those designations, or we do, and we need to start hurrying up since the 17th of January is getting quite close. Then in terms of your ICT requirements, you obviously need to ensure that you've got really good security, availability, continuity, and quality of services. Those would be your main criteria. You know, if you're familiar with your ISO 27001 or your SOC 2, you would have come across those criteria before. They're like the main pillars of any sort of cybersecurity framework. So those would be the main requirements that you would need to make in terms of compliance with DORA. I would also start with a comprehensive risk assessment to identify any sort of vulnerabilities that I may have. Remember, this law is all about active compliance and robust incident response. So another question to ask yourself is, if we were to have a data breach right now, are we ready? Unfortunately, data breaches happen. You know, I obviously don't want to bring a data breach upon you, but sadly they do happen. And you know, you can answer these questions right now, and you can say, sure, we're not ready. You know, we don't have our incident response ducks in a row, so to speak. We haven't really practiced our incident response. Who do we call? It's questions like that that you need to start asking yourself, and you need to be very prepared in terms of having really good incident response. Do you know who to report to? How quickly can you come back online, for instance? And do you know if something is, how critical it is, how quickly you need to report it? And then, you know, as part of your ongoing compliance with DORA, you obviously need to conduct resilience testing, especially in your critical areas. That's definitely where I would start. So do your risk assessment and then start resilience testing in critical areas which you know that there's a lot of sensitive data. There could be a lot of financial data, personal data sitting within those areas. And if they were to get attacked, obviously it would cause a major disruption, as well as huge reputational damage and even a fine. So got to be careful there. But yeah, start doing resilience testing in your critical areas. And then once you've done all of that, you need to think about your contracts. So especially if you are fulfilling the role of a financial entity, you need to start thinking about, okay, well, what do my contracts with my ICT service providers say, especially if my service provider is quite critical to our services. And then also as an ICT service provider, if you've got any subcontractors, so remember it's the whole supply chain. If you've got any subcontractors that are very critical, you might need to also impose obligations on them. So we need to make sure that the obligation to comply with DORA goes from the financial entity to the third-party service provider to any subcontractors. It needs to be a good flow. And then any critical service, third-party service providers outside the EU must have a subsidiary in the EU, but operations can happen outside of the EU. So that's an interesting caveat. So just remember, like I said earlier in my example, if you're based in Australia, for instance, but you have a lot of European clients, you might need to investigate opening a subsidiary within the EU. But obviously your operations can continue in Australia or globally or wherever they take place. And then knowledge sharing and advocacy is also very important, as I mentioned, as the fifth pillar of DORA. But yeah, so those are the main practical steps that I would take to get ready. And then obviously, DORA it can be very time consuming. As I said, it's quite a difficult framework to comply with. It can be very technical, and the deadlines are pretty tight considering that it is the 17th of January that you need to comply. And that's where I think Scytale can really help. So we are a complete compliance hub. We've got many frameworks. Here is our framework page. So as I said to you, if you've got your ISO 27001 ducks in a row, or your cyber essentials, or your SOC 2 ducks in a row, then complying with DORA will obviously be a lot better or a lot easier for you. And then obviously we've also got our new DORA framework. So if you're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, you've obviously now answered those questions and you're like, okay, we're definitely a third party critical service provider, we're definitely a financial entity, but we don't know where to start. Scytale can obviously help you. So we can help you with any of your ISO audits, your ISO compliance, as well as your compliance with DORA. So I think those two frameworks, they really complement each other and go really well together. And then also the GDPR. So if perhaps you're familiar with the GDPR, you'll know that it's also extraterritorial. We're talking about the same sort of, incident response. There's also very tight timelines to report any sort of personal data breaches to supervisory authorities. So, so these are the various frameworks that I think work quite well together. And, once you, I guess, in the habit of complying with one framework, then you've got the others that sort of, back to back and help you comply. So I wouldn't say, look at these frameworks in silos. Look at them working together, helping you be obviously a very resilient organization, a very compliant organization, and one that, if you comply with all these various frameworks, has a fantastic reputation and means you'll get more clients because you are very compliant. Okay, so that's our presentation for today. I must remind you that at the top of the page, you can book a demo. So you can click that button. And if you'd like to know anything more about, for instance, your DORA compliance, any of our other frameworks that, might interest you, please book a demo with us today. And we can definitely help you. Okay, and then obviously I'm happy to take some questions. So, okay, so I'm going to look at, I think we have already answered David's question. And then, so we have already answered that question. And then, yes, I have answered that if I'm based outside the EU, you must still comply. So as I said to you, your key criteria there would be if you are selling to anyone within the EU, then you need to comply with DORA. Let's see what other questions. Okay, are there any penalties for not complying with DORA? Yes, there are, as with anything in life. If there's a law and you don't comply, there obviously are penalties. So once again, I hark back to how similar this is written to the GDPR. It's also percentage-based penalties. So the GDPR is 4%, and DORA is 2% of your global turnover. So that would probably be one of the most maximum fines that you could get. And then I think it's also, yes, it's 1 million euro on individuals. So if you are a senior individual within the company and you are found to not be, keeping up with DORA, and you think, we don't have to care, this isn't important to us, then unfortunately you might face a fine of up to 1 million euros. There might be criminal penalties in some states. It depends on the European member state that obviously you need to comply with. So in some instances, there might be criminal penalties too. But obviously with the new law, we are yet to see. Okay, and then we have another question here. Okay, does DORA affect relationships with third-party service providers or cloud service providers, and how can startups ensure compliance with such arrangements? So I think once again we need to go back to what designations are we talking about? So if your third-party service provider or cloud service provider is designated as critical, so remember we went through size, if they were to have a disruption, what would be the effect? Then you need to, I think, look at your contracts. That would be my first place to start. Is if you know that you're a startup, you're in the financial industry, remember you've got these obligations falling upon your shoulders. How do you back to back those within the third party service space? Maybe if you are dealing with a really big third party service provider, remember that other financial institutions are also going to be on their back to comply. So you might think, okay, well, I'm just a small startup. I'm going to make this happen. But hopefully the other the other banks or financial institutions within that will also put pressure on you to comply, or on the third party or cloud service providers to comply. But it all goes back to answering those questions of, am I a financial entity and am I a critical third party service provider? Okay, next question. Does DORA apply to only big financial institutions, or does it apply to smaller businesses too? Adar, I think once again it goes back to those questions of, if I am a smaller business, but I am in the financial sector, then 100% it applies to me. Like think about crypto. I mean, there's quite a lot of crypto startups that are quite small. So it would definitely apply to smaller businesses in crypto, any sort of, new financial startups, like trading. There's a lot of trading platforms that are startups. I know in South Africa we've got something called Easy Equities. I'm giving them some free advertising. But like for instance, I'm just thinking like something like that where it's a trading platform. They were also once a startup. They would 100% need to comply with DORA. Okay, let's see if there's any other questions. I think I've answered all of your questions that have come through. Let me know if there are any other questions. But yeah, I would always just keep asking myself, big or small, doesn't matter where I'm based. Am I a financial institution? Am I a critical ICT third-party service provider? And am I selling to anyone in the EU, or am I based in the EU? And that's your foundation. So with any act coming in, always just start with your scope of application. That's what I always do. I say, okay, well, what's the scope of application? Does this apply to me? Go through the scope, and if you can answer yes, then start with your risk assessments, and your resilience testing and your incident response, because at the end of the day, those are the most important. Okay, all right, we've got one more question here. So from Rupert, he says, does DORA compliance extend to non-critical ICT service providers? It can in certain instances. So like, for instance, I said in the terms of subcontracting. So maybe, you work over here with a critical service provider and then they subcontract something to you. So then that chain of supply, it might also then start impacting on you. So even though you're not critical, it might work like that. So it might be in limited circumstances, but it can still comply. I think for now, I would start asking myself, am I critical? Am I a financial institution? And then, maybe if you're finding yourself not critical, but you obviously are still worried about compliance, then look into your ISO and your SOC 2 compliance, because that's the basis for all compliance. Okay, any other questions before we wrap up? We'll give us another 30 seconds or so. Okay, it looks like we don't have any more questions. So I would just like to thank everybody for attending today. I hope you found the session super helpful, and that I was able to clearly explain to you and hopefully make you feel a little bit better and a little bit less stressed about your DORA compliance. Remember that you can book a demo with us at any time. At Scytale, we're always able to help you. We've got some fantastic consultants and managers that work with all of our clients. We're always there to assist and help. And yeah, I'm also there. So yep, if anytime you need help, we're obviously always willing to help you. It's super easy. We've got fantastic automation that makes compliance really easy. It makes it super easy to pass your audit. So yeah, book a demo today. And thank you so much. And yeah, best of luck with the rest of your day. Thank you.